Okay, so for this one, I'm going to try and render my little tiny glass container that I have here. I collect a lot of still life materials, through my travels. So I'm going to try and render this, and I'm going to start with a pencil. We've done this technique before, that kind of like elliptical, pretend skeleton of an inanimate object. So I'm going to start there, right? And remember, when you're sketching or you're trying to place things in a still life, it's always important to kind of set up the page. So if I want my object to kind of be in this range, I need to, make some markers so I don't, cut off important parts, right? So I'm a little bit above this guy, right? And he's not quite that big, but of course I am going to like blow him up for our intensive purposes. So I have a little bit more of a top-down view, right? Because my eyesight's much higher than this, right? So I don't see a full circle, but I see a much more open ellipse towards the bottom of this container than I do at the top, right? And so the beauty about doing this kind of like elliptical skeleton method is it kind of sets you up for, a kind of connect the dots or ridges, if you will, right? So then I can kind of, get about equal sides, right? And I'm going to work this drawing a lot more, right? So, my little Skeletor drawing here. You can also kind of mimic at some of, here's that gestural kind of shadow. This is going to be much darker under here. But I'm going to kind of leave this alone for a minute, right? Because, like I stated in the rock texture video, me working in pencil is going to be great if you guys have, half an hour, Netflix is down, and you got nothing else to watch. But I'm going to take my little chamois here, and I'm going to get some tone on the page, right? So with transparent materials, this applies for semi-transparent things like colored glass, even kind of reflective materials can fall in this category, but specifically with very clear glass materials, it's all about building up some of the tone that you see beyond and through your glass. So I can see some of the brown of my craft paper. I can see the white of the page, and I can also see how the glass distorts that, right? So I'm going to, kind of translate that to grayscale on my own. So I'm going to kind of work this in a little bit more with my vine charcoal, my preferred material. I don't think that's a surprise to any of you, right? Kind of rework my contour out a little bit, but I see this nice kind of shape, right? It's all about kind of picking out the shapes that you see beyond the glass. It's this arc, how this glass vial really distorts the colors that I see, right? So I'm gonna go right up to the rim, that lip of my glass, kind of blend that out a little bit. And then I have like the white tone of the page. Now I can kind of leave that, the tone of my newsprint, which is a little bit lighter than white. I can always take my eraser back in and kind of work that in, but I'm going to softly kind of blend that out a little bit, as I find that when I'm trying to render glass materials, that sometimes if my edges are a little too sharp, it throws off the illusion, right? So something else I see, that really open ellipse at the bottom, I see that back rim, right? So I'm not going to go fully, I'm just going to kind of connect maybe about, if that's half of the back rim, probably about 3/4, maybe a little bit less. Kind of work that back out. But I'm going to leave that open for right now, right? Because I also have that beautiful kind of like weighted shadow, right? It's a cast shadow. My light is directly above my object. As you can see, right? My light is directly above. But this is going to help ground my object, right? So you guys can see that I'm starting to get that appearance of some kind of three-dimensional cylinder. What I'm also going to do, I have this really kind of loopy shadow, right? And it's that cast shadow from the top of the rim reflecting on the paper. I'm going to add that in, right? So it's not quite as big as my lips on the bottom, but I'm going to kind of add that in. It's very gestural, very loose, and very blended, right? And so with these shadows that are on the paper, if you soften up their edges a little bit, you're going to get that appearance of like more of like a cast shadow effect, as opposed to like that harsh kind of shadow I see right beneath the glass. The bottom portion of my container is also a little bit darker, right? So I'm just going to add some tone there. Remember, this guy or chamois is a really good option for that, as it helps kind of put that tone down, right? So I have, essence of what I see. I'm also going to add some tone right to the lip of my container, right? It gets a little bit darker up towards this ridge. But when you're working on transparent things, it is literally all about building up the tone you see around it, right? And then focusing on the other things, right? So just to kind of stay true to my drawing, I'm going to kind of cut my back paper in half, a little bit different of an angle. I'm going to let you guys figure out what technique I could use to make sure I get the essence of that angle. I'm going to give some darkness up here, mainly because that craft paper is a much darker tone than the white of the page. So for my drawing's sake, I'm going to add a little bit more richness so you guys can like more easily see. You can see by just addressing that negative space, my glass is already starting to come out a lot more than when I had it just, you know, on the newsprint by itself, right? So this is still a very loose and kind of gestural rendering. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my eraser, and I'm also going to take my compressed charcoal. I'm going to pull out some of those highlights and those deeper shadows, right? So I kind of have this line running down the ridge here. I'm going to crisp that up a little bit. I, of course, could also switch to a pencil, but as we all know that, you know, graphite and charcoal don't love each other, right? So I'm going to use a little bit different of a compressed charcoal. My other one was a little bit big, but I'm going to really start pulling in some of those really specific lines and shapes, right? And it's kind of, I always say 1, 2, skip a few, right? You don't want to do all of it, but you want to do some of it just to kind of get the essence, right? So it's really all about what parts you kind of give that push and pull to. What's going to become blended tone and what's going to be a crisp contour, right? You guys can see I can just blend out some of those edges a little sharper just by kind of working some of that vine charcoal in, right? So I am going to really push this cast shadow at the bottom, mainly because I really love cast shadows and making them very dramatic, right? But this is also going to help my glass pop off the ground a little more. I'm going to leave this one faded, right? I'm just going to leave that guy alone. The next thing, let's see. I'm going to ignore my little decorative flowers for right now and just try to, you know, get the illusion and the appearance of that glass. So I'm going to, you know, always editing the process, right? You can always go back and kind of push and pull again. Really trying to get that ridge, that curve of the top of the glass. Work that in slowly. It's a little too much there. And I'm also going to kind of pull some of this across, right? We always talk about kind of cross contour. This still applies to when you're working with a very like smooth material. You know, pulling the like that shadow across in the same direction can really help, right? It's just going to help kind of your drawing come along and that kind of thing. I'm going to deepen that background shadow a little bit. I'm going to push this edge out just a hair because I'm going to erase back into it. All right. Let's see. I'm going to add this highlight here. Excuse me. I'm also going to kind of come down with the flat end of my eraser and kind of work this part back in, right? And kind of really illuminate that side. So it's just helping this transparent glass pop off a little bit more. Just lost my vine charcoal. I'm also going to work some of these crisper edges towards the bottom, really kind of round out that 3/4 of appearance. Starting to get that transparent look. You know, it's one of those things too that you really have to not only pay attention to the light and shadow, but just take your time, right? And really kind of work back and forth. I'm gonna shake off some of this and pull slowly, right? All right, I'm not too happy with this side. I'm gonna lighten this back up ever so slightly. And you know, if I'm doing this in pencil, I'm building up that tone just as slow, right? It's all about that kind of slow and steady process. I'm going to work this shadow back in just a little bit. Kind of lost it a little bit when I was erasing. Work that shadow back in. I'm also going to pull this back in, this edge back here, and make that a little darker you know, go big or go home, right? So a little bit more reflection down on the bottom as well. And there's some in the front too that I'm going to kind of pull around. And then I'm going to just run my eraser gently across here just to kind of pull that edge back to the front, right? I don't want to lose my shadow, but I want to get that appearance of that kind of like disruption of that glass, right? And so overall, you know, it's a work in progress, but I'm getting the feel of that transparency. I'm getting the feel of that glass, right? And so it's all about that kind of push and pull and knowing when to kind of leave some of those harsher highlights and walk away, right? So hopefully this gives you a little bit better of an idea of how to render transparent objects.